I said, my name is Don Lindsay. I've been working with QAD for a couple of years. And so, as Alex also mentioned, we do webinars on QAD functionality in June and July last year. Did a couple of webinars on MRP. I did one on forecasting, CRP, advanced forecasting, if it used the simulation forecast in 22.7. We did that. So today I thought that I would continue the mode and talk about shop floor control. I did a quick little study just last week, and I went in and I dumped through browse or progress the primary tables for QAD, the sales order, the purchase order, the work orders, the DR HIS, the op HIS, the GL DR HIS, etc., etc. And I found it interesting that 75% of the records in QAD had to do with shop floor control, and 25% had to do with other things, accounting, who cares, sales orders, that kind of thing. So shop floor control is a very, very important part of QAD. Now I'm going to use a couple of terms that I'll use interchangeably. Either production activity control, that comes from the old Apex terminology, execution and control of operations. Anybody Apex certified? Taken the Apex certification exam, so you're probably familiar with execution and control of operations. That's what the national organization Apex calls it. And then shop floor control, which is the term that QAD uses. So we'll try and go through a fair number of topics today having to do with shop floor control, all the way from automation and release. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other shop floor control tools, advanced repetitive, flow scheduling, Kanban, that kind of thing. And we'll cover up with production orders for those of us who are going on to, what is it, 2019? What's the latest version now?
2018 out now, 2019.
2019, okay. So, as with anything that we talk about in terms of either QAD or Apex, there's lots of terminology that may be new to a lot of us. Some of us may be familiar, maybe you don't know what critical ratio is, or you've never used non-productive labor transactions. So there's a lot of things that we might talk about. Is everybody on maintenance? Everybody on maintenance has access to support or knowledge base? Good, good. Go out and look at, or you can do like Mr. Taylor said this morning, Google it and find out what it means. So where does ERP have shop floor control in its structure? Well, we've got the old Apex ERP structure, production planning, master scheduling, material requirements planning. Each one of those then has a capacity level associated with it. And finally, way down at the bottom is production activity control. Now, it may look a little bit less important than you might think, but all the top above it just plans it. Shop floor control is where you execute. So that's what we're going to cover today. So what is the definition? From the Apex dictionary, it's the function of routing and dispatching the work to be accomplished through the production facility and or performed by suppliers. Do any of us do subcontracting? So, same sort of functionality. Shop floor control encompasses the principles, approaches, techniques needed to schedule, control, and measure, and evaluate the effectiveness of our production operations. It's usually on a fairly close-in horizon. It's usually not more than 2 or 3 days out. Some people use shop floor control out for 3 or 4 weeks. I work with a lot of companies that actually do shop floor control on an hourly basis. So SFC is near term and does the execution of the planning that is done at the top levels in QAD. If you want to learn a little bit about MRP or master scheduling, you can go on Alex's website and look at some of the webinars that we've got posted out there. But it's in essence to optimize the use of resources. So what are our resources? Labor, primarily, machines, tools, labor, cost, those kinds of things. To minimize work in process, because one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to just start dumping work orders out into the production system. You don't want to do that. You want to keep those work orders within the control of production activity or production planning, and so we try to minimize the work in process, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the ultimate is to make your customers happy, right? Because the customer is going to call, where's my parts? And you want to be able to say, where is that work order? Where is that thing? So I can go out and look for it. So this responsibility of shop floor control, of production activity control, for the executions of the plans developed above its own process, or planning and controlling within that ERP framework. So the building blocks of shop floor control are, and this goes without saying, accurate data. We've talked about MRP. MRP requires accurate data, shop floor control, same thing. You need to have visibility of what is out there. I don't know how many times I've gone into a facility and lots of work orders out in the shop, lots of information going in the computer, doesn't even resemble it. No place. So you need to make sure that the accuracy of the data is there so you can control it. An attainable, realistic, buildable master schedule. And we could spend a whole 2 or 3 days on SIOP, sales and operation planning, and what it means to have a viable, doable, plannable master production schedule. We need to appropriately define work centers, and we'll look at the work center files a little bit later. Then some sort of scheduling or priority system. You know, we'll talk about various kinds of scheduling, backward scheduling, forward scheduling, and priorities, critical ratio, slack time. A lot of different kinds of tools that we use for that. And then an order release and control system, what we sometimes refer to as an authorization system. And then, obviously, the movement of work in process through those work orders out there in terms of move from operation to operation, issue of parts from inventory into WIP, the receipt of work in process back into inventory. We need to accurately represent that. To, again, make sure that we've got information that the whole organization can use to maximize the customer service, optimize the resource, and minimize work in process. So those are the building blocks that we need. It all kind of starts off with the authorization and release process. So that, in most of our cases, is MRP. And this is just a little foil overhead I had from the webinar we did in June. And it's kind of a simple process. You got a starting quantity on hand. In this case, I've got 20 scheduled. This could be a purchase order or a work order. And I've got a demand for 35 out there in period 5. So what MRP does is it goes out and it projects availability out to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th period down to 5th period. The demand is 35. I've only got 30 available at the end of period 4. So I've got a negative projected quantity on hand. A negative projected quantity on hand is the same as saying I've got a net requirement. Net requirement requires that I have a planned order for that. I'm going to offset it, in this case, by 2-week lead time. And it says I'm going to release that planned order in period 3. My projected quantity on hand again goes to 0, and we could go out, 52 periods out in the future if we needed to. So that planned order then becomes our tool to be able to authorize and release product. So again, we could spend a whole lot of time on that MRP and master production scheduling, but in essence, those planned orders are what we are going to use to release. 2310, planned order work approval. It's going to come into MRP as a planned order. That's what MRP does, plans order. And so the planner is going to go through and firm those orders up and hopefully use this 2310 process to be able to actually create orders that can be released out into the shop floor. Some people don't use this. I work with one company right now where they manually create every single work order they do. They don't use MRP. Somebody use MRP? Come on, somebody raise your hand. You don't just create your own work orders, do you? Maybe you got a spreadsheet. Yeah. Oh, spreadsheet. Okay, so there's lots of tools out there that can assist that. Just a couple of years ago, QAD, how long ago did they do? 5 years ago, came out with the Master Schedule Workbench Production Scheduling Workbench, and this is a tool that's very, very usable. This is the version that Alex's 32Soft has, and it allows you to look at the schedule and basically come up with a way to release those. It also has a visual basis to it. There's some research that says if you can coordinate your eyes with your brain, you're more liable to learn something or be able to do it a little bit better. So this is another one of the tools that's available, and at the end of the session we'll talk a little bit about more production orders and what that means in terms of the next few versions of QAD in the future. So, the authorization activities, this is a point at which you're going to take a planned order or a firm planned order and you're going to turn it into a work order. So this is the authorization process. It begins with checking availability, because you don't want to just cut work orders and then start chasing parts. You would like to be able to check the availability of your material. We have another webinar. You could look at capacity requirements planning, make sure that you've got capacity. Has anybody used tooling, like plastic injection molding or machine shops? So tooling is a very important part of that. So it's the checking of availability and then the gathering together of documentation. So the documents that go out onto the shop, does anybody have prints that go out with that? Instructions, other documents, specifications, those kind of things, blueprints. Those are gathered up and then they are either kitted or staged. Kitting is the act of gathering all this process together, and that could take, in some cases, 2-3 days, maybe a week to gather all that information together, and then it's either released directly or staged, and it usually is staged if it's got part shortages. So this becomes the process of authorizing the product to be released. So what kind of information do we need to do that? Well, we need to know how many are going to be produced. That comes from MRP open orders. We need to know when those parts are needed, and we saw that by that lead time offset, the difference between the due date and the release date of the lead time is when we need it. What operations, we'll talk about routings and what that means in terms of shop floor control. How much of time it takes to do those operations in terms of setup and run, or what we call the operation lead times, and in terms of what we call inter-operation lead times. We'll talk about those. And then the appropriate definition of work centers. With this information, you can start to affect the execution and control of operations out on the shop floor. So one of the first things you need to do when you set up anything in QAD. Before you even create your part numbers in QAD, what do you have to have? A product line, right? You got to have a product line. So, if any of you have been into 2.1.1, this is where you define the various accounts that are going to be associated with either sales orders or purchase orders or supply or service and support activities. And one of the frames is this work order account. So this is how QAD is going to use the transactions within the operational side of the business. Well, this is where you get into EE. And so you define the various accounts that are going to be getting data from the work order system. The first is for floor stock. Remember the little checkbox on the bottom of 1.4.7 that says issue policy? If that's checked, then you issue the parts. If it's not checked, then that means that that's a floor stock item. And the backflush or the bulk value of that is going to be debited to WIP or work in process when you close the work order. There's material usage variance account. There's the quantities of components that are issued versus the standard quantity required. There's rate, material rate variance, which is the cost of those components. Mixed variance is primarily for joint or core byproduct. I'm not spending any time on that, but cost of production, this is the account that's updated to track materials, subcontract costs associated with work orders or repetitive schedules. Then subcontract, usage variance, subcontract rate variance, work in process, and then finally, the biggest bugaboo, method variance. And as Alex had mentioned, we normally do a webinar once a month. And in April, I was planning to do an inventory accounting webinar. And in that, we'll talk about this method variance and where it comes from and how you might deal with it, those kinds of things. So you define your product line and then item master. So the item master file, you define your part numbers, significant, non-significant part numbers, however you determine you want to identify or ID your parts in the system. Then you've got your item number, description, unit of measure, you've got your inventory data, product line, that kind of stuff. Then you define your inventory data, lot control, site, location, location type. Location type is that anything in the item master file must then go into a location with the same location type as the item master, another control mechanism in the system. Auto numbers, anybody do auto lot numbers for your system? Right, you find that in the number range management. Then in terms of the item planning data, you've got your order policies, your order quantities, buyer planner codes, purchase, make, buy, lead times, run sequences 1 and 2 if you're using competitive, minimum, maximum orders, multiples, operation leads, and then finally your routing codes. And the system will use the BOM code equal to your part number if you don't define an alternate, or you can define your routing codes, we'll talk about in just a second. And then when you cut a manufacturing work order, you can either use those defaults of routings in BOMs, or you can go ahead and use an alternate that you have defined. If you use sites in QAD, you can go in and you can define your inventory site data in 1.4.16 and inventory planning data in 1.4.17. So if you've got different sites, you can plan those sites differently. Then you come to the product structure. Can't say how important product structure is. In May, we're going to give a little webinar called The Guts of MRP, and we'll talk about each one of these particular field values in that webinar and what that does to MRP. But basically, what you got is your parent-component relationship. So, and that's what a bill of material is. as opposed to what a lot of people think it is. It's not a part number in a list of parts. It's part number in a parent, component, parent, component. So you define your parent components. You've got a quantity per. How many does of this particular component does it take to build a particular parent? Then you've got an operation. If, for example, you make, what's a good example? Large electrical cabinet. It takes a lot of stuff to put in an electric cabinet, but you don't need the door until the absolute last step of the process. So you can define that parent-component relationship between the cabinet and the particular door and say you need an operation, 15. And then you can issue it at that level. And then stop gates, effectivity dates. You start the bill of material relationship on this date, you end it on this date. I've worked with companies that didn't do that. Not a good idea. You need to set your start and stop dates. And then there's also a lead time offset, so you can make MRP plan that parent-component relationship differently than it normally would based on your 1.4.7 manufacturing lead time. So, and you also, does anybody use formulas in here? We use formulas because we're in medical device. We make DNA, and so we have formulas. And I know the food industry uses a lot of those same sort of concepts for 15.5, the formula maintenance. Then you define your departments, and the department tells the system which accounts are going to be used to accumulate labor costs, such as labor rate variance, burden, overhead, those kinds of things. There's also a section there in the department that you can define labor in terms of, and then in the work center in 14.5, this is where the work is done. So this is the appropriate definition of work centers that we talked about. And there you can see it belongs to a department. It's got a queue time, a wait time, set up crew, run crew. We'll run through some of those calendar dates. 36.2.5, you need to define for the work center of the site the hours that you're going to work for a particular work center, and you also have to define the holidays that are going to be had so that QAD can take that into account when it schedules. So the way that shop floor control works is primarily upon lead time. Now, what is lead time? It's the total amount of time required to manufacture or purchase an item. In manufacturing, if you look at 1.4.7 or 1.4.17, this is the elapsed time between when you need the item to issue a replenishment order and when it is received into stock to be able to be issued to the next level in the bill of material. On a scheduling basis, and we'll talk about this when we get to our discussion of scheduling, it's in the routing file or the work center file. So there's, as I mentioned, operation lead times and inter-operation lead times. There is paperwork, time that it takes to release. We talked about kitting and staging. That's got a portion of lead time. Queue time, setup, run, wait, and move. Those are called the 5 elements of manufacturing lead time. If you look at setup and run, those are called the operation lead times. That's how much time that particular work order is going to be at that work center doing an operation so that we can schedule and take into account the capacity for that. The interoperation lead times, those exist between setup and run and account for basically non-productive. This is where we want to minimize the amount of work in process so we can minimize our lead time within that process. Queue time, typically in most factories, accounts for 85 to 90% of lead time. That's why we want to keep those work orders in the production planning department and not release them out on the floor. So we reduce that amount of queue time. In QAD, there's the places that you maintain these values. In 1.4.7 or 1.4.17, you can see you've got the manufacturing lead time, purchase lead time, or inspection lead time, and the CMLT. Who knows what CMLT is? Cumulative manufacturing lead time. And that tells you how far out in the future you need to forecast. In the work center, we looked at the wait and queue time and the routing. These can be overwritten when you do a work order, but that's the queue, the wait, setup, runtime, and move time for a particular work order itself. The routing. This is the primary file in the shop floor control system. 14.3.1, routing maintenance. Routing code. Lots of ways to do routing codes. You can have generic routing codes. We have codes for mixing. And mixing, you can mix all sorts of ingredients. Or you do routings, I've seen them done by part number, so that you can create a routing code equal to a part number. The operation is the sequence of events that happens to that work order as it moves through that shop floor control system. The standard operation, we'll talk about standard operations in just a second. The work center that we defined in 14.5, where the work is going to be done. If a machine is required, because you can define machines within work centers so that it actually becomes a subset of that. Description of what that is. I've seen a lot of companies use a very terse description and then make the comment section much more explanatory. Depends on how you want to do that. Machines per operation, there's your queue time and your wait time. The setup time and the run time, those are the operation lead times, as opposed to queue and wait time, which is your inter-operation lead times, and then move time, which is, again, another element of that inter-operation lead time. Start and stop dates, or effectivity in, effectivity out. The setup crew, the run crew, any tooling that might be required, and the supplier or subcontract cost if you actually send it out to have this done at a supplier. So that is the 14.13.1 routing maintenance. 14.15.1 is alternate, and this is an alternate routing method that you can define a routing for items and or sites where an item can be made in different ways, using different operations, work centers, machines, etc. So you have to define the alternate before you assign that alternate to a regular part number so that when you go into 16.1, you can tell it to use this alternate router for a work order that's going to be produced. You can manually override that in the work order. Standard operation maintenance, 14.9, is kind of handy. If you've got standard kinds of things that you do, like mixing or cutting or those kinds of things, you can create a standard operation, name it whatever you want, whatever schema that you think you need, and then you have a description, a work center, again a machine, then your setup, run, wait. You can define a yield percentage. You can have a tool code associated, a supplier, milestone operation. And milestone operations are primarily for advanced repetitive. And milestone repetitive, or milestone work operations are the places in the routing where you can report work and any previous work that has been produced. Then you can also define your inventory value, subcontract, or overlap. And overlap is a tool in the scheduling system that allows you to basically define where a particular operation must be completed before another operation can begin. And that's handled by the scheduling algorithms that are in QAD. Locations. Now, locations, as far as I'm concerned, are shop floor control, because the inventory that exists either in your warehouse or if you have locations in WIP locations where you're going to be backflushing in advance repetitive from those locations. You need to define those locations, whatever location schema you've got. You can use numbers, letters, however you think that would be most appropriate. It has a description, inventory status. This is the status of that particular location in terms of any restricted transactions that might be associated with it. You can have a type. I mentioned the fact that the location type must match the item type in the 1.4.7 so that you can only store items of a particular item type in a particular location type. There's the ability to have a single item in a location. Worked with companies that do that. Or a single lot or reference number that might be contained. There's capacity for this work center, or for this location. Reserved and transfers are for consignment kinds of things. So locations are the next portion of that. Reason codes can be used for many things in QAD. In terms of shop floor control, it's usually used for downtime definitions, but we'll look at 1620 or 16.20.4, which is non-productive labor, and see how we can record that for the accountants. Okay, the work order life cycle. Work orders start off either batch or firm, or they're approved by MRP, and those feed down and create work orders. In 16.1, you can either have exploded, allocated, or released work orders. That then goes into our availability check. There's a component availability check that's available in QAD that will tell you whether you've got components ready for that. Then that feeds down into the release and print of the work order so that you now actually have a document that you can match up with your prints or your documents or your specifications or whatever to get it out to the shop floor. Then you use 16.10 work order component issue to actually issue components to the work order. Then you report labor in shop floor control. We'll look at 16.20.1, 2, and 3. Then you receive that work order, so you've added material, you've added labor, and now the work is complete. So you're going to take that assembly out of work in process and put it back into inventory. And you do that by closing the work order, either in 16.11, or I've actually seen some more progressive planning departments use 16.1, the checkbox closed. So you only close it after the variances have been now analyzed. So you close it, then you go through 16.20 or 16.21 work order accounting close, and then that drives the values into the general ledger. Some control files that you need to be aware of: the 16.20.24 shop floor control. You've got the code that tells it whether you want to automatically move the work order to its first operation, and that depends on how you define that. We have opted to make all of our kitting processes operation 50, and so we automatically, when we release the work order, it moves it to that first operation 50. These are time indicators. What's your standard hours? What are your overtime hours? 16.24, which is your work order control file. Do you automatically assign work orders, or do you manually assign work orders? I would probably recommend you do it this way. This is the next work order in sequence. Do you use work order comments by default? Or if it's unchecked, it's not going to default to it, and you'd have to put a manual comment on. Same with routers. And here's the move to first operation. So there's a whole series in the new EE version, 36.9 control files, which are the accounting equivalent, I don't know what you call it, Dave. The accounting equivalent of the old, yeah.
It's a count.
Yeah, it's accounting. So this is the 36.9 to 11 work order accounting control. This is probably the most, or one of the most important, that you can either have for your accountants happy with you or unhappy with you. Because if you check that, every time you post a transaction, it's going to create variances in the general ledger. Maybe not a good idea, so maybe you want to leave it unchecked and have those posted only at the point of work order receipt. If you check that, you've got lots and lots of transactions that are going to be filed. The quantity complete method refers primarily to joint orders in the colon byproduct. So, what is a work order? So we create these work orders, 16.1, and you either create a manual work order or you let the system create it automatically. We'll talk about the ID and what we sometimes do as work order splitting in just a second. But you create the work order for an item and a site and a type. And the types of work orders are either E, exploded, or excuse me, expense. R is rework, and rework creates a requirement for the part number of the assembly that you're cutting the work order for, because it assumes you're going to rework that. The schedule, closed, and fixed. So you've got your work order quantity, the order dates, order release, due date, and it depends on how you do that. I know a lot of companies don't pay any attention to this. They just do what's called order launch and expedite. Just get the damn thing out there and then worry about it later. I'd recommend that we pay attention to the release date and the order date. And then there's the work order status. Work order status can either be planned, and you can only create a planned order through MRP. There's a firm, batch, exploded, allocated, released, and closed steps. And that's kind of the sequence or the family, or excuse me, the flow of the work order through the system. You can normally associate a work order with a particular sales order or supplier. You can define what the yield percentage is for that work order, and then you can make remarks and comments. Here is where you would use those alternate work orders and routers, or alternate bills of material and routers that we've defined previously, so that if this particular work order needs this particular routing, and you define that in your 14.50.1, then you can tell this work order to use that routing sequence. You can also predefine the assembly percentage, grades, expiration date, because we use this a lot in the production of DNA and food, those kinds of things. And here are the defaults that we saw from those 1.2.1 for product line definitions for work orders. So you can, if you've got security access and you don't upset your accountants, you can actually go in and change the general ledger that a particular work order is going to hit. So, work order bill maintenance, 16.13.1. I remember the day that I discovered this. Kyle was saying there's so many things that you just kind of run across. And I was up in Seattle at some Boeing subassembly plant, and I saw the planner going to this work order bill maintenance, and he pre-allocated the parts that he wanted to go on to a particular work order. I said, oh, how did you do that? This is how he did it. You stick with 16.13.1, you tell it what the work order is, what your component is, and then the quantity required, quantity allocated, and then if you check that little box, detail allocate, you can actually go in and tell it where you want that particular work order to pull from in inventory for a particular subassembly or component loss. Then you've got QAD deliver site. So the work order bill tells the system exactly how you want that bill of material to look for the work order that you created in 16.1. Same thing with the 16.13.13, the work order routing maintenance. Here again, you've got the work order, and you can go in and for an operation, you can change the quantity of whip, the op status is probably the most important here. If you want to, you can, is it me? Anybody on .NET yet? Come on. Configured screens? I know what configured screens are. Simplified screens. Yeah. Dave, you need to sell one. Yeah. But you can define this particular menu so that it automatically allows a group of users or a particular user to update just that operation. So they can put in the work order of the op, and it jumps to that operation status, and that's all that particular person can do. We're going to have another webinar later in the year on permissions and roles. So roles and permissions and socks in there, or socks. Yeah, probably. Anybody watch 2020 on Friday night about Theranos? The one up in the Bay Area? Yeah. Upset the sock. So, work order print and release. You release the work orders through 16.6. You can either move it to the first operation, or you can change and update the release date if you want to, or you can just default to the release date it is. Due date, operation, and the supplier. Or you can do multiple work order release if you're of that mode. You've got lots of those out there. Then you've defined what your bill of material for that work order needs to look like in 16.13.1. And so now you can use 16.13 or 16.10 to do work order issue. And this is used to issue inventory into a released work order. So you can do the ISS-WO, the issue of components into work orders, or you can do the ISS-TR and the RCTTR, but you basically go through and update your work order with the quantity that you've actually issued, probably from that kitting or staging process. You can also use 16.8 multiple work order change status. You can change standard, rework, or final assembly types, and you can change a number of work orders from a particular status to a whole series of other statuses. I've used this to clean up MRP orders. I've changed planned orders to allocating and deleting them all, so you can use that 16.8. This is one I said that we would talk about a caution. You can split a work order, because a work order is associated with the 16.1. It also assigns a lot number or an ID to that work order. You can split that work order so that you can have two IDs associated with one work order. Some companies like to do this. My accountants don't like it, because the caution says that after components have been picked or issued, they remain attached to the original work order. So when we look at 16.3.4, the work order cost report, if you look at a base work order as opposed to a split work order, you see all sorts of weird variances, and we know variances are very confusing anyway. So you can do work order splits. There's lots of cautions on it, but the system does have that possibility. Then, once you've created the work order, you've issued the parts, you've applied labor, you've done the work order receipt, and now you're ready to move that final finished assembly into inventory. You use 16.11. So you tell it what work order ID you got, the quantity that you're going to complete, if you're going to scrap any of those final assembly schedules or final assembly part numbers off of the work order, which site, location, and if they've got any reference. So this credits WIP and debits inventory. And this, you can also use this to set attributes for the particular item, either the status, inventory status, expiration date, grades, those kinds of things. So you can also use 1612. I'm not real fond of 1612. It's probably one of the more complex transactions in QAD. It's got 6 screens, something complicated to do, but it basically combines the issue and receipt process into one menu. So you can use it to do the work order issue, the receipt, rejections from work orders, and the ISSTR and RCTTR. So you can combine all of those into one transaction. And then finally, the last step of the work order cycle is 16.21. And 16.21 takes all of those variances that you've created in the work order, your flow stock, your material rate, usage variance, subcontract, etc., cleans out that from the WIP account and debits then the variance accounts that you again defined in that 1.2.1. So, labor feedback. Labor feedback, you've got to be employed before you can do labor feedback, so you need to create the employee number, however you want to do that. For some strange reason, people that did our employee numbers started them with 000. I don't know why they did that. It makes it very confusing. But you create your employee numbers, and then in 16.20.1, labor feedback by work order, or labor feedback by employee or work center, you can enter information in on the work order for the work order and the operation. And then the second has to do with the standard times, either start, stop, or elapsed, and operation complete, move to next, or previously complete. And I found that they really need to teach your operators how this works, because if they don't do it right, that can really mess up the shop's work control. You can also reject and rework parts within 16.21, and this allows a little pop-up that you can use a reason code for and assign different reject quantities and such to individual work or reason code. 1620.4, that non-productive labor feedback. Here you can define reason codes. Is the guy not working because his machine's broken, or he went to a safety meeting, or he's repairing meeting tooling, or he's got a meeting with his boss. However you want to do this, this is usually defined by your accounting department. And then there's 3 transactions: operation complete, operation move, and operation scrap, that you can create within the shop floor control system, or you can actually do it through those 16.20.1, 2, and 3 transactions if you want. But this generates a work order scrap in the operation history records, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with the counting. So there's lots of browsers and reports and inquiries that you can use in shop floor control to get a better handle on this. Priorities. Priorities in any system are, first of all, your order and operation priorities. And these come pretty much from your MRP system. There's also a vertical priority, which means all the parts that go into a parent higher level have the same priority, and a horizontal where common parts need to be coordinated across the product lines. There's also informal priorities. Major company customers, high volume penalties that you might have. The problem with informal priorities is that a lot of times informal priority rules usually kind of tend to default to the normal process of operation, and you lose track of the actual priorities that are controlled through the system through your operation and your order priorities. So, scheduling. Scheduling rules. Scheduling rules are intended to meet priority dates and to effectively use your manufacturing resources. It involves establishing start and finish dates for each work order and each operation needed to complete the work order. There's a number of different kinds of scheduling priority calculations: start date, operation due date, earliest required date, etc., etc. I like critical ratio. That tells you how far that work order is back in the system. But it says no single priority rule is the best for all situations. You're going to have to use various priority rules for various work centers, for various work orders. The key is to make sure everybody in the supply chain knows what those priority rules are and how to apply them. Scheduling priority rules based on slack time or first in, first out, fewest operations remain. These are all, again, types of priority schemes that you can use. The two basic types of scheduling are backward scheduling and forward scheduling. Forward scheduling takes a release date, which we saw from our MRP, and forward schedules to a completion date. So it schedules out across the system. The backward scheduling starts at a completion date and schedules backwards to a start date. So that the forward scheduling calculates completion dates and backward scheduling calculates start dates. Here's just a little example of a scheduling forward schedule. Here I've got operation 10 and 20 in work center 8 and 10 with a hour-and-a-half setup, 0.2 runtime with 100 units, which means I've got a total standard time of 21.5, which runs about off to 3. In operation 20, 5 half-hour of setup, 0.3 runtime, times 100 is about 30.5 hours, which is 4. So now I can go ahead and, based on my work center data, I can take my work center 8, which has 2 days of queue, 1 day of wait, and 1 day of move, which we saw from the work center file. 9 has 4 days of queue and 1 and 1. And so now I can simply go in and calculate what my values are. I start that work order to arrive in operation 10, work center 8 on 103. I can add to it the queue days, the operation days, the final date, how much it's going to take me to wait and move to the next operation. It's going to go into the next operation on manufacturing work date 110. I've got 4 days of queue, 4 days of operation time. It's going to finish on 118. Takes me 2 days to wait and complete it, so it's going to be completed on day 20. That's how QAD does its forward scheduling algorithm. There's operation status codes that you can use, and you can do this either in 16.13.13, work order routing maintenance, or you can automatically set it if you use those 16.20.1, 2, and 3 labor feedback transactions. So what does it mean to effectively schedule? First of all, you've got better chance of on-time deliveries, reduced work in process because you're keeping those work orders out of WIP and you're controlling what's being worked on. You've got reduced manufacturing lead time, so you can reduce the shop time from 2 weeks to 2 days. So you can do a quicker job of promising orders to your customers. More efficient utilization of resource, increased productivity, reduced chaos out the floor. Shop foremen don't like chaos, so the more control you've got, the more they trust you, the better you will execute the shop. Reduced manpower, costs are more accurately determined, and you can solve problems earlier. So, how do you do that? You do it with the dispatch list. A dispatch list is a list for priority control. It's a list of the work order to be done in priority sequence. It includes available and scheduled work. It communicates priorities to the shop floor, both the foreman and the people out on the floor that are doing the work. And it can take the form of paper, communication, online, display boards. I was talking to Hood last night at dinner, and he says he's got a big 36-inch TV out on the shop floor, and they know exactly what they're going to be working on because they've got their dispatch list electronically projected out onto the shop floor. So the dispatch list basically is the center and the date that you're at. It lists the released work orders that you've got in the system and what is in queue, waiting to be worked on, and then jobs at prior work order or work centers waiting to come into this work center. So you can see if I finish this and this work order that's at this previous work center that Frank is working on is going to be here tomorrow, so you do a much better job of scheduling. Lots of different kinds of dispatch rules. Rules for what did worked on first, second, etc. I like the critical ratio. It's dividing the time remaining until due date divided by the time remaining on the work order. It's kind of a quick, simple calculation that says this one needs to be done quicker because you got enough time to do it. Or, who has this? The boss comes out and says, work on this one, I don't care what you do. So, you've got a work center dispatch report in QAD, standard. We've created our own. You can see I've got a simple calculation here for a critical ratio, which I simply took the values out of the tables and did a quick calculation in the browse, and now I've got a critical ratio for my shop guys out on the production floor. Production reporting is this action of 16.20.1. It can be done with labor collection, move tickets, inventory, given the barcoding, RF, lots of different ways to get it in. How many use barcoding? Eagle, RF, Freedom, yeah, good stuff. So you want to know what the order status is, where the job is. Exception reports, what is not on schedule or is on schedule. Inventory status, where are the components, what are the value of work in process that you've currently got out on the shop floor. Labor reports that tell you efficiency, utilization, machine performance in terms of tooling. This all gets recorded in 16.20.13.8. The operation transaction browse, if anybody has been in there, that's a very, very handy set of information. It comes out of the op_his table, and it tells you everything that has happened out on the shop floor. The other table that's very handy to become familiar with is TR-HIS. Is that again is going to be all of the issue and move transactions, shipments of POs, work order receipts, purchase order receipts, etc. So these are all the op history transactions that you can find in there. Efficiency and utilization. Efficiency and utilization monitor the factors that affect capacity. Efficiency is basically the standard hours of product produced. So if you produce one thing and it takes 1/10 of an hour, you've earned 1/10 of an hour of standard hours earned, divided by the actual hours worked. So this shows you how efficient that work center is at getting things done. And utilization is actual hours worked over available hours. So if I actually work 10 hours and I plan for 8 hours, that means my utilization is a little bit less. And QAD has 2 reports that you can run: efficiency by work center report and work order utilization report will give you those values. And these help you understand how efficient those particular work centers are going to be driven at. Other factors that you need to keep track of: machine downtime, tooling, tooling availability, additional setups, those kinds of things. You need to be able to measure those and keep track of those and compare them to the plan. Input-output control is another technique that can be used. It's for shop floor and capacity planner that monitors planned input versus planned output. Actual input versus actual output. Planned Q versus actual Q. So these help us monitor the system to the performance of what we expect from our planning process. Principles are that you want the output to be less than or equal to the input, so that you're not building inventory. It can be used to correct causes of variances, helps you control the rate of input of work orders into the shop, and again, as we said, hold back those work orders on the production floor. Again, QAD has this input-out control report. I remember when I first started to use QAD, J.D. Edwards, SAP, Infor, they didn't have input-output control, but PAM, being Apex certified, had this input-output control. So it's in there and available for your use. Some cost considerations. Item cost in 1.4.9. Oop, too much. Standard cost and routing, and again, we'll talk about this in April when we talk about the material or cost impacts of inventory. There's 16.22, which is with material cost revaluation. If you change standard cost, then you've got to revalue the work in process, so you get the journal entries that have to be done. And then work order variance, and I won't even attempt to go into this because it's very confusing. And you can get this in 16.3.4, work order cost report. If you look at the headings in these columns, you can see there's accumulated cost, expected cost, accrued variance, accrued cost, rate variance used to date, and then down at the bottom you've got this method change variance. So understanding those variance reports are important. The managers like this one because the print's big, so it's easy for them to read. There are other shop floor control functions within QAD. Whip trace, advanced repetitive, flow scheduling, Kanban, production orders. Whip trace allows you to actually trace lots or serial numbers of product within work in process. Advanced repetitive, if you cut a work order, it's a part number on a quantity on a date. If you use advanced repetitive, it's a part number on a pick-through period with no quantity. So advanced repetitive is sometimes more applicable to tracking shop floor control. I worked with Paul Rubin. If you know Paul, he's an advanced repetitive bigot. He says you shouldn't read his work orders, you should always read advanced repetitive. Key advanced features are finance scheduling. You can create these multiple period order quantities. You can automatically backflush labor. It's got rework, scrapping of parts, tracking inventory is much better. Flexible variance accounting, scraps, all sorts of good stuff. There's also flow scheduling. Flow scheduling is a module that generates time, phase, sequence, statements of production requirements for production lines in a flow manufacturing environment. It does that, believe it or not. Then there's Kanban. Somebody use Kanban? I know Hood has used Kanban. There's a whole huge Kanban module, lean manufacturing module out there that's available, and was based on the production, Toyota production system, TPS. And it basically uses cards, because Kanban in Japanese means a signal. So you can have cards, containers, lights, lines on the floor, lots of different ways that you can do that. 1 card, 2 card system, you can do that. Production orders. As Dave had mentioned, production orders are the next future. We had lean processes, Kanban, back in EE208. Then we had the master scheduling workbench, the production scheduling workbench in 2010. CBOS and quality work orders came in 2015, 2016. Serialization and packaging was there, and then agile material handling was introduced in 2016, and now production orders are the wave of the future. Production orders, all of the functionality still exists. So you've still got work orders, advanced repetitive, Kanban, flow, repetitive, production schedule, master schedule. All of the capabilities of the system exist. They've just simplified the functionality, simplified the menus, and extended capabilities in a lot of ways. If anybody's staying for the trainings tomorrow and Thursday that Logan's putting on, they're going to go through production orders in detail for you. So it's the foundation of the future. When I had the opportunity to set in on Brent and Guido's presentation at Explorer last year, production orders are amazing, amazing tool. There's also barcoding. I'm not going to spend any barcoding. You can talk to Shirley or the two Jims at Bradley or anybody about barcoding. Great way to do shop floor control. Enhances accuracy and consistency. So, I'm 3 minutes late. We know where shop floor sits in the ERP system. We looked at the data requirements, foundations, we looked at the work order process, scheduling, priorities, input, output control, cost, and then talked about the future. So shop floor control is a huge part of your success in your utilization of QAD. It's where the rubber meets the road. 32Soft also has a number of data loaders that can assist in that. You can load work order component issue, work order bills, et cetera, et cetera. So, any questions?